Welcome students, welcome trainees, welcome trials. Today we have a mock debate on the issue at hand. The issue at hand is thus. In this mock debate, you are a Frost Death Knight, maybe even a Survival Hunter, why not an Enhancement Shaman? Okay, you are in that range. You want to get into the raid in Dragonflight, you think one of these three specs is nice, so you want to play them, and then in Dragonflight, you want to get into your spot for a melee spec in the raid roster, and then you look in front of you, and you realize that you're going to have Arms Warrior, Fury Warrior, Subtlety, Outlaw, and Assassination Rogue, plus Retribution Paladin, Windwalker Monk, Feral Druid, Havoc Demon Hunter, all as the potential recipient for a mandatory raid buff that will make them a mandatory pick in the raid. Solutions? Anyone? Anyone in the stands? Anyone has a solution for this possible issue? That's the problem of today, what we are attempting to debate. The issue that Dragonflight will be bringing by expanding the amount of raid buffs and raid debuffs and mandatory stuff needed for your raid. Because up to this point, we only had 7 classes out of 12 that had something to bring. So you have a roster of 20 players, 7 out of 20 leaves you with 13 more players to bring. That's not too big of a problem. In Dragonflight, this is getting shrunk even more, because rogues are given Atrophic Poison, which is going to be a better version of Devotion Aura of Paladin, which is currently stacking, so you can bring both of them and get double the result. Plus you have a Druid, Druid being given the strongest raid buff in the game, Mark of the Wild, making a return except on steroids, because it's going to give you 3% move speed, 3% critical strike chance, and 2% magical damage taken reduction. So that's another mandatory class that will make it in, and then you have the addition of Evoker. Of course, being the new class introduced, it has to have a whole bunch of stuff worth being taken in the raid. So we now go from 7 classes having a mandatory something for the raid to 10 classes having a mandatory something for the raid. This makes it 10 out of 20, which already cuts your options by 50% in the raid. Not to mention, some of these things might be worth bringing multiple versions of the same spec or class over. Take, for example, Arcane Intellect for Mage. You don't need more than one, right? It's just one buff for everyone. But what about Priest? What about Priest with Power Infusion? What about something like Warrior with Rallying Cry? What about Evokers with their you can use your movement speed ability even when it's on cooldown type of buff? Those things can be used multiple times in the raid. You can bring multiples of them in the raid. So you have 10 out of 20 spots already locked. You only have 10 spots left to choose. Plus you have some of these that can be brought multiple times over. So this starts creating a situation where you might start having some very narrow positions to fill in your roster with the specs and classes left over. The specs and classes left over are Shaman, Death Knight, and Hunter. These are the only 3 classes without anything worth bringing as a mandatory pick. Hunter is the one who has it worst. They even lost their more unique thing, which was Binding Shot, the root, which allowed you to control the adds in certain boss fights. Now the root has been changed into a stun, so it's useless now. There are plenty of other classes that can do that already, and now all they have is an immunity aspect of the turtle. That's it. Death Knight is on a higher up range because they have Anti-Magic Zone, which is still okay, it's not that good after they nerfed it, but at least it does something for the raid. And then they have Anti-Magic Shell, which can also be used to cheese certain mechanics. Plus, they have Mass Grip, and they also have single target grips for ad control as well. That's on a decent end. And then lastly, you have Shaman. Shaman, instead of having a single worth to bring into the raid all the time type of buff, they have 25 different possible options to bring to the raid, none of which is mandatory. Stun Totem, Slow Totem, Tremor Totem, Speed Totem, 2 different types of Mana Regen Totems. You have a possible 25-second cooldown AoE knockup. You can even take a single target stun. You still have the shortest interrupt in the game. You still have plenty of other good things, but none of these are worth a spot in the raid by default. And this is the issue that we have to debate at the moment, because as I was starting to debate what to play in Dragonflight, before we start to actually come to this decision by looking at how the spec plays, looking at the rotation, the buttons, the damage it does, the healing it does, you know, that type of try to guess the meta specs of Dragonflight minigame, which will come soon enough. Even before that, even before looking at that, there are going to be certain things that will completely bypass that minigame. Because it doesn't matter how Frost Death Knight plays, it doesn't matter how fun it is, how the rotation is good, how well it has been tuned, how the options in the talents are all diverse and engaging, if you are playing in a raid roster who is going to bring a rogue for a raid buff, a red paladin for the raid buff, a warrior for the raid buff, a windwalker monk for the raid buff, and a Havoc Demon Hunter for the raid buff. That's 5 melee DPS. 5 melee DPS in your raid roster is already a good enough number. You have the possible problem of having multiple specs in the melee range, in the melee camp, bringing a raid buff or bringing a raid debuff, cucking you completely out of a raid spot. Even before you start thinking about how well the spec plays and whatnot, there is simply no room for you. The problem can also be quite big for tanks, because unlike melee DPS, which can come in 6 or 7 or 8 of them, tanks are only 2. And look at the raid buffs. The raid buffs or raid debuffs of Dragonflight are brought by Demon Hunter, Druid, Monk, Paladin, and Warrior. That's 5 different tanks, potentially with a raid buff. This means that once your raid roster completes filling out the healers, completes filling out the melee DPS and the range DPS, what's left for the tanks is not going to be who is the strongest tank, who is the most meta tank for tankiness or for damage in the raid. It's just gonna be, okay, which raid buff or raid debuff did we not get yet? We don't have a Windwalker Monk in our roster, and Mistweaver is shit, so none of our healers wanted to play Mistweaver. Guess what? Brewmaster Monk is gonna be your tank. There is no discussion there. It's gonna be a mandatory choice. Guess what? Somehow, someway, we have no Havoc Demon Hunters in our roster. That's it. Your other tank spot will be Avengers Demon Hunter because you need the Chaos Brand debuff. That's the other problem that can happen with having these many raid buffs. Having to fill your raid with so many raid buffs and raid debuffs can bring you into these type of situations. And that's what I'm thinking about it right now, because as I was starting to think about which specs or classes could be interesting to play in Dragonflight, even before seeing the sims, the rotations, who is OP, who is simming the best damage and all that sort of stuff, as I said before, this type of mandatory stuff is actually going to matter a lot in the raid. Of course, you can still be bailed out. We have seen this even now in Shadowlands. Even if you bring nothing to the raid, even if you are completely selfish and you offer nothing to your friends, like a survival hunter, you can still be meta if your numbers are OP. You can still make some room for the OP spec into your raid, even if they don't bring anything. It happened with survival, it happened before with other specs without a particular raid buff like rogues. Rogues will get a raid buff in Dragonflight, but before they had nothing, and they have been meta plenty of times in the raid, even if they were not offering anything much after they lost Smoke Bomb. So these things happen multiple times, but then again, do you really want to start your Dragonflight experience by hoping that Blizzard will buff your spec to be super OP as your only chance of getting a spot in the raid? That seems like a long shot for the 3 classes left out, Shaman, Death Knight, and Hunter. Having to stay there and hope that Blizzard will make you OP just to get a spot doesn't seem like the best course of action when you want to choose your class for Dragonflight. At the very least, in a glass half full manner, this is not as bad. As a matter of fact, this is even good for Mythic Plus, because while the raid makes this situation even worse, because now you have 20 possible spots, so you go from 7 mandatory classes to 10 mandatory classes. It's even harder to fill out your raid roster, having to manage all of these mandatory things. In Mythic Plus it gets easier because your spots in Mythic Plus are just 5. This means that the raid-wide buffs get much less of a benefit in Mythic Plus. If you get a buff to give you 10% more stamina to 20 players, that's 200% total stamina more, because it affects 20 players. If you do it to a party, it's just 50%. It's 1/4 of the power. The same goes for every other type of raid buff. Not to mention, if you add more and more and more raid buffs, it's gonna become less and less important to have the good ones. If instead of having 3 total raid buffs in the entirety of the game that you can fill easily in Mythic Plus, if instead of that you have 30 raid buffs, it becomes much less important to tailor your Mythic Plus group to all of these buffs and debuffs, because there is so many that they lose value. Mythic Plus doesn't really and won't suffer really from this type of extension of buffs and raid buffs and debuffs and whatnot added in Dragonflight. This is going to be specifically an issue with raiding. Mythic Plus is much more interested in way less things than the raid. Mythic Plus in general wants damage. Who's the best tank? The tank with the most damage. Who's the best healer? The healer with the most damage. Who's the best DPS? The DPS with the most damage. That's usually what they go for as the meta in Mythic Plus. Raid buffs and raid debuffs don't matter that much. Look at this season and even the last season of Mythic Plus. The meta tank is Death Knight, which brings no raid buffs and no raid debuffs whatsoever. The meta DPS is Survival, which brings no raid buffs and no raid debuffs. And even one of the good things of Warlock, which is also meta, is something like a Gateway, which is not nearly as powerful in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. Or things like Curses on bosses not being nearly as powerful in Mythic Plus. So Mythic Plus doesn't care about that. This extension of mandatory picks in the raid won't really impact Mythic Plus whatsoever. The real issue is going to be for the raid composition. Having to reach certain trade-offs, certain compromises in your roster, you know, as you start getting into Dragonflight, maybe your raid leader, your guild members start talking about what they're gonna play, you know, just in case you don't end up with a roster with 15 different evokers, right? You start talking about it, and very quickly you will have to start picking up some sort of graph, some sort of grid with all of the classes, all of the raid buffs, all of the raid debuffs, and try to make a somewhat sensible composition to be able to fill all of the spots in your group with all of these things. That is the issue I see happening in Dragonflight, and I wish it could be resolved before the release of the expansion. But given how deep we are in the development, I think like I'm sort of screaming at the clouds right now. I am an angry man screeching at the clouds about a problem that very likely won't be resolved, and we will have to go live in this situation in Dragonflight. So to close, as a TLDR of the title of our video, yes, unfortunately, you have to be worried as a hunter, as a Death Knight, and as a Shaman if you're interested in raiding in Dragonflight. You will simply put yourself in a worse position than pretty much all of the other 10 classes that are going to be able to have a guaranteed spot in the raid if you choose one of these specs. Not as much as we said, not as much in Mythic Plus, where these type of mandatory things matter much less. So awaiting the tuning, awaiting the touches and changes to the numbers of the classes and specs. Perhaps some of these will become completely busted. Nobody will care that Elemental or that Survival or that Marksmanship bring nothing to the raid because their numbers will be huge. But in case that doesn't happen, it will just make it harder for those specs to find spots in the raid. That is my point, and that's why I think it's not very good for the health of your raid roster, your raid composition, and your guild group going into Dragonflight. With this being said, let me guys know what you think about this. Let me guys know if you have noticed this potential issue as well, something that might create some problems along the way when it comes to raiding for the health of the game, with all of these different classes and specs potentially being left out of raid rosters purely because Blizzard didn't give them something worth bringing all the time like to the other 10 classes. Or if you're just not worried, if you just believe you will find a spot yourself, you know, your guild doesn't care too much about these type of things, if you're good, you can make it in the raid anyways, there is certainly going to be plenty of players with that type of mindset and finding themselves in that type of position. So, let me guys know your point of views as we close this Thursday's video. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the supporters on my Patreon for being a big help in what allows me to continue to produce content for WoW as we go deeper into the beta of Dragonflight. Tomorrow, I believe, we should have a few more changes in the beta. Generally speaking, with the new build coming out, we will see if we get something by tomorrow. But for now, we can just stop and wait. As usual, for the support, you guys can like and comment down below, and especially subscribe to the channel itself. That is very helpful in getting more and more visibility throughout the WoW community. Also, To finish, for more social interactions, more general simping and closer parasocial relationships, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing, of course, to my Patreon right to this side of the video on those two links. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, it's getting cold, okay, that's true, but not quite as cold as I would want. I would want like 2 to 3 more degrees down, where you kind of start feeling your feet getting cold. That's the level I would like to be at right now.